Ben Radcliffe had been floating through the desolate void of Sector A-37 when the bright beam of light pierced his cockpit. The unassuming human engineer, out on a repair mission for a failing satellite relay, hadn't even had time to send out a distress signal. One moment, he was adjusting his trajectory, and the next, a force greater than anything he'd ever experienced latched onto his ship, dragging it toward a massive, unmarked vessel. The ship was like nothing he'd ever seen. Smooth, blackened metal pulsating faintly with an eerie blue light, giving it an almost organic presence. Ben's breath caught as he realized its scale. It could swallow his craft 1,000 times over. Before he could react further, the cockpit was flooded with an anesthetic mist. Darkness took him. Ben awoke in a sterile chamber, his arms and legs strapped to a smooth, warm surface. The air was thick with the faint scent of ozone and something metallic. Above him, intricate patterns of alien script glowed softly on the ceiling, their purpose unknown to him. A silhouette loomed in his periphery. "Subject 7463 is awake," said a voice, calm and precise. It was the kind of voice that betrayed no emotion, only clinical detachment. "Prepare for initial examination." Ben turned his head as much as he could, catching sight of his captor, or his examiner. The alien was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like polished silver under the cold lights. Her elongated skull and luminescent blue eyes gave her a distinctly otherworldly beauty. She moved with an unnerving grace, her long fingers clutching a sleek, tablet-like device. "Where am I?" Ben croaked, his throat dry. "What do you want?" The alien's gaze flicked to him briefly before returning to her device. "You are aboard the Vrexial Research Station. Your physiological profile has been deemed unique for interspecies study." "Study?" Ben said, his pulse quickening. "I'm not some lab rat." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Your cooperation is irrelevant. The data will be collected regardless." Ben struggled against his restraints, but they held firm. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Or are you just going to be the alien who ruined my life?" For a moment, she hesitated, as if considering whether to answer. "I am Zrina, lead xenobiologist of this station." "Well, Zrina," Ben said, forcing a lopsided grin despite his fear, "I'd say it's nice to meet you, but under the circumstances." Her silver eyebrows arched ever so slightly, and she turned back to her device. "Fascinating. Even under stress, your species displays humor as a defense mechanism." Days, or perhaps weeks, passed. Ben had no sense of time within the sterile confines of the station. Zrina subjected him to a series of tests, scans, physical examinations, and strange, pulsating machines that hummed as they probed his neural pathways. Despite the invasive procedures, she never inflicted pain. If anything, she seemed almost curious. Ben's defiance remained intact. He answered her cold, clinical questions with snarky quips, hoping to needle the seemingly emotionless scientist. To his surprise, it seemed to work. "You are remarkably resilient for a species with such a limited lifespan," Zrina commented one day as she monitored his vital signs. "And you're remarkably talkative for someone who kidnapped me," Ben shot back. "What's the matter, Zrina? Running out of subjects to torment?" She paused, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. "Your emotional displays are intriguing." "Glad to know I'm entertaining," Ben said. "Any chance you could let me go now? Or is interesting the only thing keeping me alive?" Her silence stretched longer than usual, and for a fleeting moment, Ben thought he saw something in her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty. Over time, Ben began to notice things about the station. Its pristine hallways, lined with glowing panels, weren't as lifeless as they first seemed. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors, cries and groans that sent chills down his spine. Other subjects, other experiments. "Zrina," he said one day, his voice low, "what's really going on here? I've heard things. People are suffering." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over her tablet. "You misunderstand. The experiments are necessary. Our survival depends on understanding the weaknesses of other species." "Survival?" Ben repeated. "You're not under attack. You're the ones doing the attacking. Zrina's gaze hardened. You cannot comprehend the stakes. Our world faces annihilation if we fail to evolve. And you think torturing others is the answer? Ben snapped. You're no better than the monsters you claim to fight. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, her mask of detachment cracked. It is not torture. It is science. Then why do you look like you're starting to doubt that? Her luminous eyes met his, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then she turned and left the room without another word. The turning point came during an emergency aboard the station. A containment breach in one of the experiment chambers sent shockwaves through the facility. Alarms blared, and the once sterile corridors filled with chaos. Zrina arrived in Ben's chamber, her composure shaken. "You will assist me," she said, releasing his restraints. Ben sat up, rubbing his wrists. "Oh, now you need my help? What happened to the subject's cooperation is irrelevant." "Do not test me, human," she snapped. "Lives are at stake." "Fine," he said, standing. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." Together, they navigated the labyrinthine station, dodging malfunctioning security drones and unstable energy fields. Along the way, Ben witnessed the horrors Zrina had hidden from him. Chambers filled with alien beings, their bodies ravaged by experiments. "Zrina," he said, his voice heavy, "this has to stop." She didn't reply, but he noticed the tension in her jaw, the way her hands trembled as she input commands into her device. As they worked together to stabilize the breach, Ben saw a new side of Zrina. She was brilliant, yes, but also fiercely determined and, beneath her cold exterior, deeply conflicted. For her part, Zrina began to see Ben not as a subject, but as a person, someone who challenged her in ways she never thought possible. When the crisis was finally contained, they stood in the wreckage of the affected chamber. "This isn't sustainable," Ben said. "You can't keep doing this." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you propose?" "Help me stop it," he said. "Help me free the others." Zrina's gaze softened, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain. "If I do this, I betray everything I have worked for." "And if you don't," Ben said, stepping closer, "you lose what's left of yourself." She didn't answer, but the flicker of emotion in her eyes told him she was beginning to understand. The days following the containment breach were fraught with tension. Zrina, once unflinchingly dedicated to her work, began showing cracks in her icy resolve. She spent hours reviewing her research logs, her luminous eyes flickering with doubt. Ben, meanwhile, had been observing the station's layout and routines, piecing together an escape plan. But freedom wasn't enough for Ben anymore. He couldn't leave the other captives behind. He couldn't leave them to a fate he now knew all too well. One day, as Zrina entered his chamber for another round of tests, he decided to make his move. "I know you're not just a heartless scientist, Zrina," Ben said. "I've seen it in the way you hesitate, the way you look at the others when you think no one's watching." Zrina froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of her sleek tablet. "You presume too much, human." "Do I?" Ben countered, stepping closer. "I think you hate what this place has turned you into. I think you want out just as much as I do." Her gaze wavered, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable passing through her features. "Even if I wished to change things, it is impossible. The overseers would see to that." Ben leaned in, his voice low and firm. "Then we take them down together." The overseers, Zrina explained, were the architects of the experiments and the enforcers of the station's grim mission. They operated from the command nexus at the heart of the station, their presence rarely seen but always felt. Advanced AI systems, interwoven with organic components, gave them near-omniscient control over the facility. "They monitor everything," Zrina said, her tone grim. "Even now, our conversation may be under scrutiny." Ben smirked. "Then we'd better give them something to look at." Despite his bravado, the task ahead was daunting. Zrina's defection alone would trigger alarms, and without her insider knowledge, any rebellion would be crushed before it began. Together, they formulated a plan, one that hinged on Zrina's access to restricted systems and Ben's ingenuity as an engineer. Under the pretense of routine tests, Zrina began smuggling information to Ben, blueprints of the station, security protocols, and the locations of the other captives. Ben, in turn, rigged small devices from the alien tech left in his cell, crafting rudimentary EMP grenades and signal jammers. Their first act of rebellion was freeing the nearest captive, a hulking reptilian being named Ta, whose strength proved invaluable. Ta, like Ben, had been subjected to countless experiments, but his gratitude was tempered by a desire for vengeance. "Free the others," Ta growled, his voice like grinding stone. "Together, we can tear this place apart." The trio moved cautiously, evading patrols and disabling surveillance systems. Each new captive they freed added to their ranks, but also to the risk of detection. Zrina's knowledge of the station's blind spots and override codes proved crucial, though her growing involvement didn't go unnoticed. The overseers acted faster than Ben had anticipated. On the third day of their rebellion, Zrina's access privileges were revoked, and an automated alert system unleashed security drones to hunt the fugitives. In the chaos that followed, Ben and Zrina found themselves cornered in a narrow corridor, their escape route blocked by a towering drone armed with plasma cannons. "This might be it," Ben muttered, clutching one of his improvised grenades. Zrina glanced at him, a rare flicker of humor in her otherwise grim expression. "You said you wanted to go out fighting." "Not quite this literally," Ben replied, tossing the grenade. The explosion rocked the corridor, disabling the drone but triggering secondary alarms. As the smoke cleared, Ben noticed Zrina clutching her side, a faint, silvery liquid seeping through her fingers. "You're hurt," he said, moving to support her. "It is minor," she insisted, though her voice faltered. "We must keep moving." The rebellion culminated in an all-out assault on the command nexus. By then, their ragtag group had grown to include beings from across the galaxy, species Ben had never even dreamed existed. Each of them had suffered under the overseers, and each had a reason to fight. Zrina led them through the labyrinthine station, her intimate knowledge of its systems allowing them to bypass traps and lockdowns. When they finally breached the nexus, they were met by a sight that chilled Ben to his core. The overseers were not beings in the traditional sense. They were towering constructs of metal and flesh, their bodies fused with the station itself. Their voices echoed in unison, cold and mechanical. "Defectors. Subjects. You dare challenge the order?" "We dare," Zrina said, stepping forward despite her injuries. Her voice was steady, defiant. "Your experiments have gone too far. I will no longer be complicit." The battle that followed was nothing short of chaos. The overseers controlled the station's systems, turning it against the rebels. Doors slammed shut, oxygen levels fluctuated, and automated defenses sprang to life. But Ben and Zrina fought with a determination that surprised even themselves. Ben's engineering skills proved invaluable as he hacked into the overseers' systems to disable their defenses. Zrina, despite her injuries, used her deep understanding of the station's technology to outmaneuver their enemies. When the final overseer fell, the station went eerily silent. The rebels stood among the wreckage, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. But the victory came at a cost. Zrina collapsed, her injuries catching up with her. Ben caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her in his arms. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Her luminous eyes met his, and for the first time, they were filled with something other than cold detachment. "Perhaps there is hope for your kind after all," she murmured, a faint smile playing on her lips. As the station's remaining systems began to fail, the group prepared for their escape. But Ben knew their fight wasn't over. The overseers may have fallen, but their legacy, the countless other stations, the untold number of captives, remained. He looked down at Zrina, her breathing shallow but steady. "We'll finish this," he promised. Together. The liberated captives gathered in one of the station's docking bays, now eerily silent after the fall of the overseers. Dozens of alien beings, some towering and insectoid, others small and delicate, stood in uneasy unity. Most had never spoken a word to one another, yet a shared desire for freedom bound them tighter than any language. Ben worked furiously at a console beside one of the surviving ships, its design an amalgamation of sleek alien technology and robust functionality. Zrina leaned weakly against the wall. Her silvery skin dimmed with exhaustion, but her gaze sharp. She watched him tinker with wires and emitters, his human hands moving with precision and resolve. "Are you certain this signal will reach the other stations?" she asked. Ben nodded without looking up. "It'll take time to propagate across the network, but the Overseer's infrastructure is still intact. If I piggyback off the station's primary relay and amplify the signal with these," he gestured at the makeshift antenna array, "then yeah, every one of their stations will hear the message. And if they retaliate before the captives can organize?" Zrina's voice betrayed a rare hint of worry. Ben glanced at her. "Then we give them a fight they'll never forget?" Ben's plan was simple in theory but perilous in execution. Send a subversive broadcast across the Overseer's interstellar network, warning captives on other stations of their oppressors' vulnerabilities. The message would include schematics, tactics, and a rallying cry to join the rebellion. It wasn't long before the system hummed to life. Zrina, now propped up beside Ben, adjusted the translation matrix to account for the diverse species that would receive the signal. "Attention," Ben began, his voice resolute but urgent. "This is a message to anyone held against their will in the Overseer's stations. We've seen their tyranny. We've fought back, and now we know they can be defeated. You're not alone. You're not powerless. Rise up." He uploaded detailed instructions into the relay. As the signal launched, the station shuddered. Emergency alarms blared, and Zrina's eyes widened. "They've detected the transmission," she said. Ben cursed under his breath. "How fast can they respond?" Zrina's hands flew across the console, her voice clipped. "Assuming they rear out drones or vessels from nearby sectors, less than an hour." Time was running out. The rebels scrambled to board the remaining functional ships in the station's hangar. Ben and Zrina stayed behind to ensure the signal's full transmission, knowing the cost of failure. Ta, the reptilian warrior, stood at the hatch of the lead vessel, bellowing commands. "Hurry! If we are to escape, it must be now." Ben glanced at Zrina. "Go with them. I'll finish here." Zrina shook her head. "You'll never make it out in time alone." "Zrina," Ben began, but she cut him off with a glare. "I did not betray everything I knew just to abandon this fight. We finish it together." He couldn't argue with her conviction, so he simply nodded. The final moments were a blur of frantic activity. As the last line of code uploaded, the station systems retaliated. Sparks flew from the console, and the lights dimmed. A distant rumble signaled the arrival of Overseer reinforcements. "Time to go," Ben yelled. They sprinted to the nearest ship, its engines already roaring to life. Ta hauled them aboard just as the hangar bay doors began to close. The vessel lurched forward, escaping into the void with seconds to spare. The journey to safety was fraught with tension. The liberated rebels had been united by necessity, but their differences quickly surfaced. Disagreements over strategy and trust led to heated arguments, particularly between Ta's more aggressive faction and a group of insectoid beings who favored stealth and diplomacy. Ben, who had emerged as an unlikely leader, struggled to mediate. "We're not going to win this war if we turn on each other," he said during one particularly volatile meeting. "The Overseers are the enemy. Let's not forget that." Zrina watched from the sidelines, her gaze thoughtful. Later, she approached Ben in the dimly lit cockpit. "You handle them well," she said. Ben scoffed. "Barely. Half of them think I'm an idiot. The other half probably want me dead." "They respect you," Zrina said simply, "even if they do not admit it." Ben looked at her, surprised. "And you? Do you respect me?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a faint smile, she said, "Perhaps." The group's next move was critical. With the transmission sent, the Overseers would undoubtedly tighten their control, making future uprisings even harder. They needed a symbol, a decisive victory that would inspire others to join the rebellion. Zrina proposed a bold plan. Strike a supply convoy that served multiple Overseer stations. Not only would it disrupt their operations, but it would also provide much-needed resources for the rebels. "It's dangerous," Ben said. "They'll be expecting retaliation." "Which is why we must act swiftly," Zrina replied. "They will not expect a coordinated attack so soon." The mission required every ounce of their cunning and courage. With Ben's engineering expertise, Zrina's tactical knowledge, and Ta's brute strength, they orchestrated a daring ambush. The battle was fierce, but the rebels emerged victorious, their ships laden with supplies. News of the victory spread faster than they'd anticipated. Across the network, reports of uprisings began to trickle in. Captives were fighting back, emboldened by the rebels' success. As the rebellion gained momentum, Ben and Zrina found themselves drawn closer together. Their shared experiences forged a bond that transcended their differences, though neither fully acknowledged it. One night, as the ship drifted in the quiet of deep space, Ben found Zrina in the observation chamber, staring out at the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked, joining her. "I do not require sleep as you do," she replied, her voice soft. "Right. Alien biology." He leaned against the glass, his gaze distant. "Do you ever think about what's next? After all this?" She turned to him, her luminous eyes searching his. "I used to think my purpose was singular, to serve the overseers, to advance our survival. Now," she trailed off, her expression unreadable. "Now you're free," Ben said. "Am I?" she asked, almost to herself. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative but steady. "You are, and we'll figure out the rest together." She didn't pull away. The rebel fleet grew as liberated captives from other stations joined their cause, bringing new skills, ships, and stories of defiance. The influx of new recruits invigorated the rebellion, but also introduced complications. With every victory, the overseers escalated their efforts to crush the uprising, and fractures began to form within the coalition. As the rebels prepared for their next strike, Zrina revealed a deeply buried truth. She had once stood at the heart of the overseers' plans. "It wasn't always like this," she confessed to Ben one night, her voice heavy with regret. They were in the ship's engine room, the low hum of the reactor filling the silence between them. "The overseers began as a safeguard, a way for my people to survive extinction. But their logic became twisted, their methods merciless. I stayed because I thought I could make a difference." "And now?" Ben asked, his expression soft but probing. She hesitated, her gaze distant. "Now I wonder if my defection is enough to atone for what I allowed to happen." Ben placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not just atoning. You're leading the charge to fix it. That's what matters." In the weeks that followed, the rebels intercepted an encrypted overseer transmission. It contained coordinates to a remote facility described only as Prime Nexus. Zrina recognized it immediately. It was the overseer's command hub, the place where their network and leadership converged. "This is it," she said during a strategy meeting aboard the lead rebel ship. "Destroying the Nexus will cripple their operations galaxy-wide." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Ta grunted. "It will be heavily defended. A direct assault would be suicide." Ben leaned forward, studying the holographic map. "What if we didn't attack head-on? What if we infiltrated it instead?" "Impossible," Zrina said. "The Overseer's defenses are impenetrable." "Impenetrable for them," Ben countered. "But we've got you. You know their systems better than anyone." Zrina met his gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "If we do this, there will be no turning back. Success or failure, the Overseers will never stop hunting us." Ben smirked. "Good. I'm tired of running." The infiltration team consisted of Ben, Zrina, and a small group of seasoned fighters, including Ta. Disguised as a captured vessel, they approached the Prime Nexus, their ship transmitting old Overseer identification codes that Zrina had retrieved. The Nexus loomed before them, a colossal structure of dark metal and glowing conduits. It pulsed with energy, an unsettling reminder that it was as much alive as it was a machine. "Once we're inside," Zrina said, her voice steady but tense, "we'll have a narrow window to disable their primary systems. If we fail—" "We won't," Ben interrupted, his confidence masking the gnawing fear in his gut. "Let's do this." They docked without incident, the old codes holding long enough to grant them access. But as they moved through the Nexus's labyrinthine corridors, the station seemed to sense their presence. Hostile intruders detected, a mechanical voice droned, followed by the echo of approaching footsteps. "Looks like we've been made," Ta growled, unslinging his weapon. "Hold them off," Zrina ordered. "Ben and I will proceed to the core." The heart of the Prime Nexus was an enormous chamber filled with pulsating conduits and glowing nodes. At its center was the Overseer core, a massive, spherical construct, its surface a swirling mix of liquid metal and light. Ben and Zrina approached cautiously, their every step accompanied by the hum of the station's defenses. "This is it," Zrina said, her voice a whisper. "If we overload the core, the entire Nexus will collapse." Ben glanced at her. "How long will it take to set up?" "Minutes," she replied. "But once I start, the core will fight back. It's designed to adapt." Ben nodded. "Then let's make sure it doesn't get the chance." As Zrina interfaced with the core, the chamber began to quake. Sparks flew from the conduits, and the Overseer's voice thundered through the room. "Traitor, your betrayal will not go unpunished." Ben drew his improvised blaster, firing at the drones that descended from the ceiling. "They don't sound happy." Zrina's fingers flew across the interface, her luminous eyes glowing brighter as she concentrated. "I need more time." "Take all the time you need," Ben said, shooting down another drone. "Just don't die on me." The core's defenses intensified, and Ben found himself overwhelmed. A drone's plasma blast grazed his shoulder, sending him to the ground with a grunt of pain. "Ben," Zrina called, her voice laced with panic. "I'm fine," he lied, struggling to his feet. "Keep going." Zrina hesitated, then returned her focus to the interface. The core emitted a deafening screech, its surface rippling as it began to retaliate against her commands. Suddenly, a massive energy surge erupted from the core, knocking Zrina backward. She hit the ground hard, her body trembling as she tried to rise. "Zrina!" Ben shouted, rushing to her side. She shook her head, her voice faint. "The core is resisting. It's linked to me. If I don't maintain the connection, the overload won't complete." Ben's heart sank as he realized what she meant. "You can't stay connected. It'll kill you." Her gaze met his, filled with both determination and sorrow. "If we don't finish this, the rebellion will fail. This is the only way." "No," Ben said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "We'll find another way. Together." But Zrina gently placed a hand on his cheek, her touch warm despite the chaos around them. "You've already shown me there's more to life than survival. Now show the galaxy there's more to life than fear." Before he could protest, she pushed him back and reconnected to the core. Her body convulsed as the overload process resumed, the room filling with blinding light. Ben watched in helpless anguish as Zrina sacrificed herself to destroy the Overseer's greatest weapon. The core's sphere began to rupture, sending waves of energy rippling through the chamber. "Zrina!" he cried, but she didn't respond. A voice crackled through his comm device. "Radcliffe, the station's collapsing." It was Ta. Ben clenched his fists, his heart breaking. "I'm coming." He sprinted toward the exit, dodging falling debris and explosions. As he reached the docking bay, he turned back for one final look at the core chamber, now engulfed in flames. "I'll finish what you started," he whispered. The rebel ship launched just as the Nexus detonated, a brilliant explosion that lit up the void. The rebel fleet gathered at a distant rendezvous point, the destruction of the Prime Nexus visible as a distant flicker against the backdrop of stars. The rebels were battered but alive, their ships a patchwork of salvaged vessels bearing the scars of countless battles. Ben sat in the observation deck of the lead ship, staring out into the void. His shoulders still ached from the fight, but the real pain lay deeper, in the empty space beside him. Zrina's absence felt like a wound he couldn't mend. Ta entered the room, his heavy steps echoing in the quiet. "You did it," he said gruffly. "The Overseers are broken. Their network is in chaos." Ben didn't turn. Zrina did it. She gave everything. Ta nodded, his reptilian face solemn. She believed in something greater than herself. "We all owe her our freedom." The destruction of the Prime Nexus rippled across the galaxy. With the Overseer's central command severed, their stations fell into disarray. Rebel uprisings flared across the cosmos, many emboldened by the broadcast Ben and Zrina had sent. The Overseer's drones, once unstoppable, faltered as their programming fragmented. Ben found himself thrust into a role he never wanted. The face of the rebellion. Messages from across the galaxy flooded the fleet. Captives turned fighters, pledging their allegiance to the cause. In one of the first meetings of the newly formed Rebel Council, Ben stood before representatives of dozens of species. "We've dealt the overseers a critical blow," he said, his voice firm despite the weight of grief pressing on him. "But this isn't over. They're scattered, but they're not gone. We need to stay united, fight for the futures Rhina believed in, a galaxy where no one lives in chains." Cheers erupted, voices of every tone and frequency echoing through the chamber. For the first time, Ben felt a flicker of hope. Months passed, and the rebellion grew into a force to be reckoned with. The overseers, now fragmented and leaderless, were hunted down one by one. Some stations surrendered peacefully, their captors too afraid to resist. Others fought bitterly, their defeat marking the final throes of an empire built on cruelty. Ben carried Zrina's memory with him every step of the way. He had commissioned a memorial aboard the flagship, a simple, glowing mural of a starburst, symbolizing the light she had ignited in the darkest of places. One day, as he stood before it, he was joined by a young alien woman, a recent recruit who had been freed by the rebellion. "She was your friend?" the recruit asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and admiration. "She was more than that," Ben said softly. "She taught me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." The recruit nodded, gazing at the mural. "We won't forget her." The final Overseer station fell 2 years after the destruction of the Prime Nexus. The galaxy, once dominated by fear, began to heal. Trade routes reopened, alliances formed, and entire civilizations emerged from the shadows of oppression. Ben, now a reluctant hero, found solace in small victories. The laughter of children in liberated colonies, the rebuilding of homes, the hope in the eyes of those who had once known only despair. One evening, as he stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching the stars, Ta approached. "The galaxy owes you much," the reptilian warrior said. "It owes Zrina," Ben replied. Ta grunted in agreement, then handed Ben a small, glowing data crystal. "What's this?" Ben asked. "From the Overseer's archives," Ta said. "It mentions her people, a distant colony, long thought lost. Perhaps you might find some part of her there." Ben stared at the crystal, a new determination sparking in his chest. Months later, aboard a lone starship, Ben set a course for the coordinates on the crystal. The rebellion had prevailed, but his personal journey was far from over. The memory of Zrina guided him, her voice echoing in his mind with every step he took into the unknown. As the stars stretched into streaks of light, Ben smiled faintly. The galaxy was free, but the adventure was just beginning.